In the early to mid-2000s, 3D platformers were still relatively common, but this was around the time when they started to get a bit more experimental in their approach. You'd often see them trying to do something a little bit different to stand out from what came before, whether it be adjustments made to the core gameplay, a larger emphasis on story, or even something as simple as crass humor taking center stage. In its early days, the original Xbox was trying all sorts of different genres to see what stuck. As you can plainly see nowadays, shooters and driving games have become the Xbox brand's bread and butter. But early on, a couple of developers also tried their hands at making 3D platformers for Microsoft's first ever game console. And we would get some successful exclusives such as Oddworld Munch's Odyssey and the Blink series, but what I want to spend some time on today is one of the original Xbox's lesser-known 3D platformers, 2003's Voodoo Vince. Voodoo Vince is a really interesting case. It was released in late 2003, and it just sort of came and went. It reviewed decently enough for its time, but after it was released, not a whole lot of people really talked about it. Heck, Electronic Gaming Monthly's review of it in its December 2003 issue states that it was, quote, merely an appetizer for psychonauts, around the time that game was stuck in development hell. Speaking of which, that's 2 videos in a row now where I've mentioned Psychonauts. I'm gonna need to cover those games on the channel in the future, aren't I? As for my own experience with Voodoo Vince, I rented it from Blockbuster Video around the time it came out and almost finished it, but I never did get around to actually buying it, sadly. Not that it really matters anyway, because both my original Xboxes stopped working, and the game was never made backwards compatible with the Xbox 360, due to the game using some custom code that was a little too complex for the 360 to run properly. So I was personally screwed if I ever wanted to play it again. But luckily, in April 2017, and stop me if you've heard this one before, the game randomly got an HD remaster for PC and Xbox One, by none other than the game's original developers, Beep Games, formerly Beep Industries. So not only would I personally finally get a chance to revisit this game in sweet HD, but now a whole new audience who may have missed out on it the first time can finally check it out. And as such, the footage you'll be seeing is from the remaster. Now, let's not waste any more time, as I assume most of you watching this have already clicked off this video because my preambles tend to go on for way too long. Let's take a look at one of the original Xbox's forgotten 3D platformers, now in HD.
Freaking idiot, dragging me out on a night like this. Might as well get this show on the road, though. Can't believe they want a 10-inch voodoo doll to go be a hero. Why can't some other perfectly good...
So what is this game even about? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Tucked away within the French Quarter of good old New Orleans sits the voodoo shop of Madame Charmaine, the voodoo priestess. One night, a couple of thugs break into her shop in an attempt to steal one of her possessions, a bag of magical zombie dust. When chaos breaks out in the shop when this robbery goes south, Charmaine attempts to stop the robbery only to get beamed by a flying chair, knocking her unconscious. These two cronies, who are named Jeb and Fingers by the way, kidnap her along with the zombie dust, but during the commotion, some of the zombie dust gets onto Vince, Madame Charmaine's third best voodoo doll, and brings him to life. Having no other choice, Charmaine summons Vince to rescue her, and this is where the game begins.
Okay.
The core gameplay of Voodoo Vince is your typical collect-a-thon platformer in a similar vein to Mario or Banjo-Kazooie. You'll run, you'll double jump, and you'll float your way around levels, but instead of collecting one unified object throughout the course of the game, like the power stars or the jigsaw pieces, some, but not all, of these levels will have you get a plot-related item at the end of a level, in order to do things like help a character in the hub level create something to progress to the next world. For example, the game's second major area will have you go through each smaller level to grab items to help them make a hot air balloon. So, in addition to standard platforming, you'll be completing a variety of tasks to advance the story, and in other levels, you're just opening the path forward. The main difference with the gameplay loop here is that it takes the objective-based gameplay seen in Mario 64 and Banjo, and breaks it up into one objective in one small level, as opposed to multiple objectives in one huge level. You won't be staying in a single level for any longer than maybe 20 minutes, or less if you really know what you're doing. I mentioned earlier that this is a collectathon platformer, but what this game does that I really applaud it for is making the collectibles actually mean something towards the gameplay. We'll start with the zombie dust. These are sprinkled around in levels, and there's a set amount of them in each. Some levels can have as many as 40, and some can have as few as 15. Collecting 100 of these will permanently increase your maximum health by 1 full unit. I would honestly recommend collecting these above all else for the later levels with more enemies. The game's combat is really simple. You have a standard 3-hit combo attack, a ground slam, and a spin attack that can also be used immediately after a double jump to get more distance, which is very useful, and I myself used it more than a handful of times. Which I guess is a good segue to talk about the game's level design. The zombie dust that got spilled out in the shuffle has warped and bent the terrain of the surrounding landscape, so you'll see a lot of uneven, warped, and bent levels and huge pieces of the ground missing. And I guess it may also be the reason for some of these characters. The game doesn't really explain it. I understand that these 2 gas pumps would come alive and be evil, but that doesn't really explain Dr. Ethel, the turtle professor. Has she just been here the entire time before the zombie dust spill? The game never really explains it. Not only is it a good excuse narratively to provide platforming challenges, but it does lead to some very interesting level design. Being a 10-inch voodoo doll, the levels all have a great sense of verticality, but one of my favorite things about that is that since the levels are a little bit more grounded in reality, like a town square or a house or a cemetery, it's almost like you yourself are shrunk down. Personally speaking, this could be just a weird fascination I've always had, but I've always loved when levels in video games shrink you down to a fraction of your normal size and have you explore what would otherwise be a normal-sized everyday place, like your house or something. I always found that perspective to have a ton of potential in a video game space. I think that's actually what that game Grounded is about. Was that game any good? The high verticality and the amount of platforming you'll be doing in this game did present me with one quirk I have with the controls, though. For the most part, it controls very well, some of the tightest controls I've ever had the privilege of experiencing in a 3D space. But one thing I would have changed is with the double jump. In a lot of games with a double jump, if you jump once and you start your descent downwards, you can usually jump again when you've begun falling. That isn't the case with this game. You can't chain your second jump as soon as you start falling after your first jump. This is a game that wants you to use your second jump at the height of your first one. Standard platforming won't be the only thing this game will have you do. As with any worthwhile platformer, there are a handful of brief alternate playstyles to break up the running and the jumping. One level will have you switching on descending rails to collect cloth for Dr. Ethel's hot air balloon in the game's second major area. In this level, you'll have to collect 100 pieces of cloth from these clotheslines, and this one can get a little hectic. Until you realize that you don't have to collect every single one as they appear. There are actually more than 100 in this level, and you're allowed to miss a few before the end of the level. Just don't hit any of the frying pans, or you'll lose the challenge and have to start all the way back. Lord knows I died a few times before I realized that, but I don't know how I managed to get to the end of the final stretch without hitting anything. Thankfully, as aggravating as this level potentially could have been, it's over pretty quickly. Another level will switch things up halfway through, tasking you with taking a spring back to a cannon, and having to navigate a portion of the level springing high into the sky. A good 4 years before Mario Galaxy did it. The entrance to the graveyard level won't even open unless you clear this memory rhythm minigame, and you already know how atrocious I am with these. The platforming is already so solid in my opinion that anytime the game tries to break away from it, like with the aforementioned descending trolley or the rhythm levels, or this level where you have to take this can of highly explosive gas all the way to a jet plane without catching fire or dropping it from too high of a ledge, come up just the slightest bit short, and honestly can get pretty aggravating when you screw them up and have to start the level all over again. You do immediately get to fly the jet plane after this level, and it's a lot of fun actually. One of the last levels in the game is this automatically moving turret level, with a gun that can overheat and with weird inverted aiming, probably because I had my camera controls set a certain way. Seriously, why do all platformers have turret levels? This level throws enemy cardboard cutout things at you that can damage you, and with the awkward aiming, the overheating of the gun, and just how fast these things fly at you, they can eat through your health like they skipped breakfast that morning. While the voodoo powers can be largely skipped over if you don't feel like collecting them, I would actually recommend making an effort to find most of, if not all of, the zombie dust in each level so you can max out your health as far as it can go up to this point, just for this level alone. You're gonna need high health here more than any other level in the game. You do get a special power about halfway through the game that'll make hunting down collectibles much easier if you want to go back to previous levels and do cleanup, so I would actually recommend that. But even so, since these levels are far in between and are pretty short anyway, I can't get but too mad at them. There really isn't even a huge penalty for getting a game over anyway. All it makes you do is start back at the beginning of the level. If you're really hard up for extra lives, leaving a level and coming back will respawn them, so it's a good quick way of farming them if you feel like you really need them. This could be the 3D platformer fan in me talking, but the basic platforming levels by themselves make the game worth playing in my opinion. I'll get more into those later. I haven't forgotten about the voodoo powers, so let's go ahead and talk about that, as this is the game's main gimmick.
Never mess with a voodoo doll, Poindexter.
Since Vince is a sentient voodoo doll, he has the power to inflict injury onto himself and have it cast onto his enemies. Enemies can still hurt him on contact, as the game states that beings created from evil magic can still harm him, but the flip side of that is that he can also inflict damage onto them. This can be done by pressing and holding both left and right triggers at the same time to activate a voodoo power. When you do, it casts an area of effect move that'll wipe out any standard enemy caught by it. I wanted to wait until now to mention this, but there are two other types of collectibles in the game. There are these purple pages that appear in about half of the levels in the game, and collecting them all will cause a purple skull to appear somewhere in the level. Activating it, chasing it, and then grabbing it when it stops will permanently extend your voodoo power meter by 1, enabling you to use your voodoo powers one additional time before needing to recharge them. You recharge them by collecting these little Mardi Gras beads from fallen enemies, and when you have at least one skull icon full, you can perform one of these AoE super attacks. You start the game with just the regular pin power here, but you unlock new ones by collecting purple voodoo icons. There are 33 of these voodoo icons in the game, which in turn means 33 voodoo powers. In addition to that, you can also use the environment to either inflict damage onto specific enemies or to solve the occasional environmental puzzle. And as cool as it sounds to take out your enemies with these voodoo powers, unlocking new ones essentially just boils down to simply unlocking a new animation that plays when you activate them. The end result is always the same, an AoE effect that instantly kills enemies. And while I didn't personally mind it, I find the animations themselves to be pretty funny. It can be a little disappointing if you're expecting the voodoo powers to have any other kind of function in combat. Finding all the voodoo icons isn't really something you'll absolutely need to go out of your way to do, but if you do, you'll at least be treated to some funny little animations when you activate them. Heck, some of them are just given to you after boss fights. On that note, hurting yourself is actually how you fight the bosses, and I'll be honest, this is one area that I think the game kinda drops the ball in my opinion.
What now? The obligatory boss battle?
In these levels, using your AoE voodoo powers like you would on normal enemies doesn't apply here. They're more like puzzles you have to solve rather than full-blown fights. You first gotta figure out how to damage them, and for most of them, once you do, repeat it 2 more times. So Nintendo's rule of threes for their boss fights is in play here too. Some of these fights, like the second one against this 2-headed alligator with burning laser vision, are just kind of boring if I'm being honest. This one just has you going up onto a high platform, activating a switch to open a pit of spikes, and diving down into it to inflict damage on it, and repeating it 2 more times, and it's honestly not super interesting and just kind of boring. This other one, an auto-scrolling boss fight against an evil statue where you need to get crushed under falling debris, starts pretty sound. But it gets annoying as more of the floor starts falling and more of the bottomless pit starts to get exposed. You can't stop moving, you can only slow yourself down, so it can get really frustrating trying to time it to where you're getting crushed by debris and not fall to your doom. But I think the most aggravating boss fight of all is the one where you're trying to crush yourself with 2 model trains. Trying to figure out your pathfinding before the trains crash, all while avoiding the boss's projectiles, like the boss before it, can get pretty frustrating. It's not like I died here a lot, it's just that it got uncomfortably close trying to time it to where the trains crashed into me. Treating the game's bosses more like puzzles is a good approach for a game starring a living voodoo doll, but they're a bit uneven, I find, and not exactly the game's strongest point. So I've gone on about what I didn't particularly care for in this game. So let's shift gears a little and talk about some of the levels I genuinely loved, which, in the grand scheme, outnumber the ones I don't like. One real standout level is an early level where you have to manipulate a clock in order to get these shops to open. It's kind of its own puzzle you have to solve. Which ones you have to go into in what order, and changing the time to get them to open. You can clear this one pretty quick if you know what order to go in. I really love the first graveyard level. Once you clear that annoying musical memory game, of course. It's nothing super fancy, it's just a really solid platforming level. One real standout level is the Sausage Factory, and those of you who have played this game know exactly how morbid this level can be. You're putting these cute little anthropomorphic animals onto conveyor belts, and you grind them up into sausage meat. Then there's this level in the trees that is nothing short of breathtaking. The lighting effects and the colors are just beautiful, and it's a pretty fun level too. One of my personal favorite levels in the game is the pirate ship. The level tasks you with finding a way onto the ship, and it'll have you doing a little half circle around to the front of it. The inside of the ship acts as its own level, and this is one of my personal favorite levels just from an aesthetic standpoint. And all of them are complemented nicely with one of the actual best video game soundtracks I've ever heard. Yes, I really just said that. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, this is a pretty good looking game, isn't it? I always thought the OG Xbox version from 2003 looked really good for its time. The Xbox was a console capable of outputting some truly remarkable visuals for its time, and this game truly benefited from being an Xbox exclusive. So naturally, 14 years and 2 console generations of technical advancements only serve to make this game look even better. The graphics are sharper, even more detailed than ever before, and it all runs at a consistent, buttery smooth 60 frames per second. The character designs do lean a little more towards the cartoony side, and some of them can look a bit rough, but the environments, in my opinion, are the true stars of the show here. You'll see landscapes bend and contort, almost like something out of a Tim Burton movie, and the color scheme used, a blend of cool blues and purples, are a real treat for the eyes. This game can look downright beautiful at times. And complementing the art style is the game's soundtrack, probably the show stealer of the entire package. This is video game jazz at its absolute best. Every single level has its own theme, and every single theme fits the atmosphere amazingly well.
That was nice. Warms my heart, wherever it is.
The game's voice acting is also well directed and performed too. There's not a single weak performance in the whole game. Vince himself is a pretty funny character too, cracking wise during gameplay and cutscenes. Not anywhere near to the extent of, say, Gex, but when he does, it usually lands.
It's going to get windy. Can't imagine anything windier than you.
For the longest time, I thought Cosmo was voiced by Brian Posehn.
The piggy bank of doom.
No, this is the first time an unpleasant fluid is leaking into my head.
This has nothing to do with the game, I just thought it was funny. Heck, the sound design is overall pretty fantastic too. I don't know how to explain it, it's just all so good. The beads make these really satisfying clicks when you pick them up.
Nice.
Just every sound effect in the game, even when you pause the game, is pleasing and memorable. I know that's a weird thing to praise the game on, but it really does add to the total package in my opinion. This HD remaster, for all the improvements made to the presentation and performance, does have a few odd, though not necessarily game-breaking, quirks. You'll encounter the occasional odd visual hiccup here and there, and some of the voice samples and the music that plays when you lose a life mysteriously cuts off partway through.
The afterlife was really short. Yeehaw! Oh, yeehaw.
And in all honesty, the game itself, aside from its voodoo gimmick, doesn't really break new ground or do anything you haven't already seen done in 3D platformers before. But when it's solid at what it does, and for the price this remaster goes for, which I'll touch on in a moment, can I really call that in particular a flaw? It's not a super long game either. It'll probably only take you about 8 or 9 hours to get to the end, even less if you're skipping all the collectibles. But the game's pacing doesn't ever really drag, I find. I say this all the time with these slightly older games, but back when this was a full-priced $50 title, things like that may have affected whether or not a game was worth shelling out the dough for. It certainly affected professional review scores at the time. And yeah, it can be harder to do that with older games that never got a re-release of any kind, but luckily, Voodoo Vince Remastered is available for only $15, which is a more than reasonable price for a game like this, if you ask me.
If cash is a problem, I accept all major credit cards.
It may not go incredibly far with the Voodoo gimmick, but it's a fun, humorous, and well-written 3D platformer, and if you're a fan of that genre and hadn't had a chance to check it out before, now's the best time. The remaster is available on the Xbox One and is backwards compatible with the Series consoles, and the PC version is available on both Steam and the Microsoft Store, so it's pretty easy to get a hold of it nowadays. Sadly, it's digital only, so no physical editions exist of this remaster on any platform. A bit of a bummer, but that's just how it is. I know I really front-loaded this review with all of my nitpicks, but at the end of the day, I can still recommend this game to anyone who likes 3D platformers, especially with how dirt cheap and easy it is to get a hold of now. And there you have it, that's Voodoo Vince Remastered. I first played this game on my holiday break from school the year it came out, so getting footage of it during the winter months was a real treat for me personally. They should make a sequel.